And then you look down, and the Prime Minister had in his hands a little card that had written on it their name with the title and some bullet points about their role to talk about. And that was the first that they all knew. Welcome to The Stay Fit, the political podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Stephen Swinford, the political editor at The Times.
I'm Lara Spirit, the deputy political editor at The Sunday Times.
And I'm Patrick Maguire, chief political commentator for The Times.
And look, this week we want to talk to you about two things. We want to talk to you about this kind of frenetic, pretty chaotic first week that Burnham's had as he's trying to get stuff off with a bang, with a kind of rolling load of announcements that we've had. And then secondly, we want to talk about where we're going next week, because from what we're picking up, there are some pretty big moments coming on social care, on NEETs, and on defence. And it's going to have a very different feel to Andy Burnham's first week in power. But let's kick off this week. And I'm going to just start on a tiny little insight into what this has been like from Andy Burnham, going from campaigning in a by-election to number 10. So on his first day, all of the political editors got invited into the Rose Garden. He walked through the door, he spoke to staff, did a lovely address, and then he came out into the garden and we had a chat with him. And it was actually an incredibly brief chat. The chat lasted for, I think, all of 6 minutes. And this caused a lot of consternation because people wanted more time and he hasn't had a lot of scrutiny. Lasted just 6 minutes and then he was whisked off. And we didn't know why he was whisked off or what it was for. What I'm told is because Donald Trump was on the line calling to congratulate him. And so he had to go on to this call and they exchanged a lot of niceties about their mothers. He talked about how his mum was in the crowd in number 10, how proud she was and how proud he was to have her there as well. And then Donald Trump obviously talks about his mum and the ancestral links to Scotland. And it was actually a very good, warm conversation. But it also highlights, I think, the kind of slight breakneck pace of everything that we've seen this week, because they are trying to kind of build this on the fly, and that is pretty hardcore.
Yeah, it is. And I think if you speak to people inside number 10, there is a feeling that, this is, as you'd expect, a complete step change. And one thing Andy Burnham said to me when I saw him last Sunday was, I'm relaxed. I know what I want to do. I've got a plan for this first week. We've spoken to the Treasury. There are no points of tension in the system. Now, if you speak to people inside government, as the late Queen so famously said, recollections at the end of this week may vary. But what I think is, look, if you're in number 10 at the end of this week, and I was just speaking to someone senior in government before we came on this podcast, I think the feeling is, yes, it's been tricky. Yes, the internal workings haven't been smooth. There've been a lot of late nights, a lot of emotions running high. But if you look at the political objectives Andy Burnham set for himself at the start of this week, with a few bumps in the road, they've had a good, solid campaigning week. But I think we've learned some things along the way about what works, what doesn't work, what needs to improve, where there isn't enough grip, and most importantly, about people. But I think what is clear, that this is, as I've written at length today in the Times, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in a minute, this is a machine. Burnham's team already knew this, but the machinery of government and officialdom is getting to know that actually, unlike Keir Starmer, this is a Prime Minister who will say, I want this, I don't like this, why do the papers say this, we've got to stop this. And instead of a Prime Minister, the phrase a senior official once used to me was, Keir Starmer's was a passive premiership. This is an active premiership with all the knock-on implications and complications for the system that implies, I think.
What do you make of it, Laura?
Yeah, I think, speaking to some people around Burnham, there's a sense of confidence that actually on one of the most important points, which is showing a divergence from those early weeks with Starmer, that they've succeeded. But it was certainly one of their key objectives to make sure they sounded, positive, that the communications are strong. I think they feel they've done that. They've got through the reshuffle now. It's done. I think there are some scars, and I think it remains to be seen whether the kind of unease that I'm picking up is something that festers, or whether or not it's something they're able to kind of manage over the coming weeks and months.
I think if we start, let's just break it down into a couple of things. Why don't we start on the policies that we've seen this week? So he told Patrick, Andy Burnham did an interview with Patrick on Sunday, and he said he wants this to be basically a cost of living government. and you've seen three significant announcements around that, and the three actually have one thread in common. So, first of all, you had the cut on VAT on electricity bills. Second of all, you had the what was the second one?
The bus fares?
Bus fares, £2 bus fare cap with Andy next to a big bus. And then third of all, you had most recently the business rates cut on pubs. All of them had issues and questions around the funding. And this is what I was told was causing a lot of difficulty, that plans that were drawn up during access talks for these big announcements for a first week. And actually two of those policies are still unfunded. The VAT cut on electricity bills is unfunded. It's from putative savings from shelving the digital ID scheme, but those savings have not been realised yet. And on the business rates, it's for the outcome of a consultation, possibly from vape shops and kind of different tax measures. But these were things, I remember the business rates one, he announced during the Makerfield by-election campaign. It was great. It was down the pub. It was a kind of big thing. And we're going to tax Amazon warehouses, all these big warehouses. That's gone because actually they've looked at the funding and decided that isn't the way to do it and wouldn't work. So that is one of the issues that we've had with Andy Burnham this week, that he is announcing things. And then in that huddle I mentioned earlier with the political editors, he announced some very big things on social care, started kind of wandering into the personal allowance, the personal allowance threshold on income tax, really expensive things. And all of these, that is going to be an ongoing question about, are your plans funded or not? And I think that is probably somewhere in coming weeks they're going to need to sharpen up their game, because there were a load of unanswered questions at the beginning of the week about a lot of these policies. They are still unanswered at the end of the week.
Yeah, the political intent, as he said to me last week, was and is, I'm not going to be able to fix everything overnight. Yeah, I haven't. There's no pretense that, I'll announce these things and tomorrow everyone will feel great. It is demonstrative politics. It's saying and the phrase that doing the rounds in number 10, right? The mantra for communicating all of this is Andy gets stuff done. That's the motto. Andy gets stuff done. That's what they want the public to think. And the announcement this week's this week's announcements are largely just that. They are announcements, because with the exception of the VAT cut, which will come into force from October, a lot of this stuff is from the next financial year, April 2027. But the point about funding is an important one, right? Because they're in this space where week one, it's all about creating, as Lara said, a vibe, a sense of direction, a sense of empathy with the public. But I've been hearing much the same as you, Steve. I had a conversation with someone at the top of government earlier this week who made the same point about access talks, that these ideas have come up in access talks, and from officialdom came the message, I'm not entirely sure that's going to work. There was some suggestion I picked up that, digital ID was actually meant to fund the bus fares as well, which indeed wasn't what we heard in the end. Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary, actually went on the morning round and said, we're still working the details of this out. But what matters to Burnham is that he's come out, he's said it, and the whole point is a government that shows a degree of agency in the face of events. It's the opposite of the early Starmer approach. I remember a couple of months ago, just before the May local elections, there was a paper by, or a Substack rather. It was described to me at first as a paper, and then it emerged it was just James Kanagasorium, the pollster's Substack, but it was about high agency politicians, right? Who are the politicians that succeed in getting people to sort of stop scrolling, to sort of stop basically surrendering to the idea that everything is terrible? It's the people who are dynamic, who narrate their motivations, who set themselves a clear objective. And even if they're just delivering little increments of things, like Zoran Mamdani, right, hasn't confiscated the wealth of loads of billionaires. Actually, if you compare what he's done in New York so far to what he promised to do, is quite small. But what he's saying is, this is the issue. I know you care about it. Okay, I've done a little bit. And that is very much that approach Andy Burnham is doing, right? It's high agency politics. It's what number 10 people were discussing about the problem with Keir Starmer 2-3 months ago, right? It wasn't a particularly high agency or high energy government. And while, yes, there'll be lots of awkward conversations about money, particularly as we approach the budget, I think on these issues, okay, an official tells you, Treasury officials tell you, look, this digital ID thing is not going to work as an answer to the funding for every policy you want to announce this week. Darren Jones pops up in the morning and says this is unfunded. Darren Jones emerges as the person in September who'll be leading a sort of fiscal responsibility caucus on the backbenches of the Labour of the PLP. But this was all about politics. This was all about campaigning and political narrative this week. And that's not to say this is a big problem. And Andy Burnham's words, as we've learned in the huddle, as we've learned over the personal allowance, etc., aren't capable of causing problems. I think those downside risks to his team felt smaller than they will later this week. And as someone has just said to me, they've been lucky with the timing. It's summer now. They've time to think, time to plan, time to grit, time to get into those bigger questions. This was for the Labour Party and for the public, a palate cleanser and and a vibe check, as it were.
I mean, and also before they came in, they had a grid of 2 weeks. And I think they kind of just knew they needed to get through these 2 weeks before they had that big machine in place as they do now, which could look at everything else that came after. So I certainly think in that respect, it's fair to say that they have got through it. And I think Patrick's Mamdani comparison is very interesting because it's that, and it's also what Mamdani has done on a number of occasions, but particularly over the involvement of private companies in his housing policies, is actually to say, yeah, I've come in and I've looked at this and I've changed my mind, and to feel confident in being able to do that. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's what Andy Burnham did on the personal allowance this week at all, but there was a confidence in the way that he was communicating by when he effectively said openly, I might change my mind on things and I'm going to do communication differently.
So look, that's where we are on policy this week, but we should talk about the reshuffle because there is still a bit of an end of that. I just wanted to start with a tiny anecdote. I bumped into a cabinet minister this morning on the way here, and it was just what it was like when they were appointed. And so they said, I got, I didn't know what I was going to get, and this is a senior cabinet minister, they got a senior job. And look, John Healey, by the way, the Chancellor, didn't know what he was going to get. Nobody knew what they were getting. So you walk down Downing Street and then you get in and you go into the cabinet office. So it's not the cabinet office, sorry, you go into the cabinet room where they hold cabinet, which is a big room with a flonking big table. And what is apparent is there were just like 4 people in there. There was Andy Burnham, there was Antonio Romeo, there was the Chief of Staff, James Purnell, and the PPS was there, Andy Burnham's PPS, and that was it. And they still at this point didn't know what they were getting. And then you look down and the Prime Minister had in his hands a little card that had written on it their name with the title and some bullet points about their role to talk about. And that was the first that they all knew. So that is an extraordinary just to give listeners a feel into what it was like. It has been very, very surreal. But look, it is a reshuffle that will have a long tail. We won't relitigate what we did on Monday with a lot of the Starmerites being out of joint in the pub and a lot of anger around there. But both of you separately are picking up that the 2024 intake are not happy.
Yeah, so as I wrote in my column this morning that, there are natural supporters of Andy Burnham, right? People who are on the Burnham train. They felt like they're on the Burnham train early. They may have resigned from government payroll jobs. They would certainly have a present in Makerfield, etc., who feel like they were led to believe that they'd be appointed to ministerial roles, right? We still haven't got the list of parliamentary private secretaries, which may soothe some nerves. But, this was a government in which 2024 intake MPs, in a couple of cases, right, look at Lucy Rugby, although she's been around Labour politics for a long time, had been in the cabinet, right, were doing Minister of State jobs, right? Keir Starmer appointed, several of them to Minister of State jobs, a couple of them to Minister of State jobs, a couple of them to junior ministerial roles in the first days of his government, right? So this is a sort of intake who's very impatient. They want it. They think they'll get jobs, and people who didn't get jobs in the last regime want to get jobs in this one. As I write in my column, there are people who feel let down and screwed over. To that, I think Burnham allies, people involved in making these decisions would say a couple of things. One is bluntly, there are not 403 jobs, right? People are going to be disappointed. What whips would tell you in some cases is that they sort of looked askance at some of the early promotions and certainly the promotions that have happened over the past 2 years in thinking this sort of creates really artificial expectations for people in that intake, right? They've lost the feeling that you'd have to grind on the backbenches, then become a PPS, then maybe if you were lucky in a couple of years become Minister of State. So it's about sort of the sense of resetting that natural order of things. But the third thing, Andy Burnham said this in cabinet on Tuesday, there is a hope that, okay, once people have sort of got over their feelings of personal loss, bereavement, resentment, they'll come back in September. And as Andy Burnham said to the cabinet on Tuesday, you are all expected to engage properly with colleagues and deeply with colleagues. They are part of the team and they've got to feel like they're part of the team. Indeed, he said that to number 10 staff on Monday as well. It's like we need to pull together as one team and change the culture. So the hope is that once MPs experience that, including the people who've lost out, that things will calm down, things will bed in, they'll enjoy themselves, they'll feel valued. But I think, Laura, because feelings and tensions are running so high this week across the party, it's an interesting question as to whether they can get over this.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that some of these snubbed MPs feel is that actually over recent weeks, there's been much made from some around Burnham of this belief that Andy is said to have, that there's great untapped potential in the 2024 intake, that he would be coming down to London. He wanted to meet all of them. That was one of the first things he'd be doing. He felt that some of them had been neglected. And I think that had created an expectation, albeit clearly misplaced. And certainly, those around Burnham would say, we were never offering jobs to these people, and there was definitely a sense, I think, of idealism from them that was now definitely wrong. That they would be getting a job. And so the interesting question will be, given that they have pledged a lot of their time in many cases to Burnham, and I think, Patrick, you and I will know of some of those who won't be happy with a PPS job. I don't think that will do the trick, is just whether or not they are angry enough to be converted into full-blown antagonists and join the ranks of perhaps Darren Jones and others come the autumn, or whether or not they will actually just come around the table as a result of the efforts that you've just revealed from Andy Burnham and others this week to make sure that the parliamentary party is brought together. And I think add to that is the extra question mark over what the whipping operation is going to look like, which of course we've heard a great deal about reform in that case, a great deal about a softening of discipline actually, and making space for a wider degree of views in the Parliamentary Labour Party. How that looks in circumstances where you have a number of them who are feeling pretty bruised, I think is an interesting question, particularly when, as we'll come on to, there's some very difficult, knotty policy questions coming down the road.
Okay, let's head to the interval. And when we come back, we're going to talk about next week. And we're going to give you a scoop about what Andy Burnham's going to be focusing on, where he wants to take things. So we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the State of It. So look, we want to talk about what Andy Burnham is going to do next week, and it is going to look and feel very different to this week. So frankly, this week felt weirdly like an election campaign. It was a leader making lots of announcements, and indeed there are going to be thousands of pieces written about, are we heading to an early election? I'm told not, and I hope for my well-being generally that we are not heading towards an early election. But so where are we going next week? What I was told is he's going to be kind of taking a more slightly statesman-like role. So rather than seeing him out and about in front of buses, you're going to see him delivering the couple of interventions. There'll be an intervention around NEETs of some form. We're not clear what that is yet. Some kind of intervention around defence. But the centre of the week is going to be a big speech about the issue closest to his heart, which is social care. Now, Andy Burnham has pledged to fix social care for once and for all, and he's got history on this. He feels burned by what happened before. So just to kind of give a very quick historical summary, he tried to fix social care when he was health secretary, and indeed held secret talks with Andrew Lansley, his Tory opposite number, to try to reach some kind of agreement. And instead it ended up with David Cameron at the dispatch box calling it a death tax, and the Tories made that the centre of their 2010 election campaign, which ultimately saw them get into power, albeit in a coalition. But he's got unfinished business. And Patrick, can you kick us off on this a bit? Because it is personal, and the most powerful bit in your interview with him was about his dad.
Yeah, and I think this is an issue Andy Burnham's cared about for a very long time. But if you speak to Andy Burnham about this issue for longer than 2 minutes, inevitably his dad Roy comes up, who's in a care home. He's suffering from Alzheimer's. As you say, Steve, I asked him when I saw him last Sunday, the eve of his becoming Prime Minister, because we all subsequently saw him giving a very long and emotional embrace to his mum, Eileen, on Downing Street. And I said, does your dad, have you had the opportunity to tell your dad you're becoming Prime Minister? And he said, very, very candidly and very directly, no. Like he doesn't know. And I remember speaking to him at the Stubshire Cross Club in Ashton in Makerfield about how he and his brothers often have to intervene and stop the staff at their dad's care home calling 999 because they don't want him to end up in hospital. And so he's seen up close. He's always understood this policy area, but he's seen very, very closely now the utter dysfunctionality of this system. And I wrote in my piece when I listened to him tell this story, and he told it in a very matter of fact, very direct way. I think he knows as well as anyone, as many people listening will know, that most families in the UK now have a story like this, or a set of stories like this, or a degree of separation from a very expensive, very dysfunctional experience of the care system. So he's long had religion on this. He's got a personal story to tell, and as you say, there is a sense of unfinished business about it. And I think I was really struck when you came back from that Pollard's huddle in the Rose Garden, Steve, and it was the thing that stood out for me from your report of that and all the reporting of it. It's like he wanted to be free at the point of use, right? So he is still invested in the policy he was advancing as health secretary and shadow health secretary, right, which is for a fully integrated national care service. And that's very, very expensive. But the other striking thing I heard him say was, I am prepared to use some of my political capital to get this through, right? There is an awareness, I'd say almost a quiet confidence on his part. And you picked this up. When I was speaking to one of his aides before I came on this call, you picked this up as well. I think there is a sense from him that, he's willing to have these difficult conversations. When no doubt there will be people inside the machine saying this is too hard. The reason why, as you keep saying, people have been kicking this can down the road for 30 years is because it's hard, it's expensive, it's politically unpalatable. But what one of his team said to me before I came on the call is that he is very prepared to say, I don't think that's right, or no, I want to do this. And that is a big adjustment to our politics. And I think when we hear him grasp the nettle on social care, it'll be a real test of that part of his temperament, the core part of his temperament, and his desire to lead and push things through with his personal authority, because there will doubtless be a backlash. There will doubtless be people trying to tax the costings to bits, doubtless people telling him, no, you can't do this. And, even with a universal death duty, the policy that's raised its head before, there'll be lots of winners in terms of the policy, but there'll be lots of losers financially too. So it's a big, big test of everything we know about Andy Burnham, the politician.
I mean, the cost is staggering of this proposal. And this is where one of the things we're going to see what Andy Burnham wants to do and his rhetoric, and that's actually going to meet the fiscal reality. If you want an NHS principal version of adult social care, that costs £18 billion. And obviously you can't do that and at the same time hit 3.5% on defence by 2035. Well, you could if you did massive cuts to the NHS. So there will be compromises. And one of the things, the way Burnham does speeches apparently is he writes them all himself, doesn't like other people writing them, and things often get decided at the last minute. So this speech is still in the offing, but I'm not sure we will end up with what he talked about in the Rose Garden. So he talked about this free at the point of use, an NHS principle to adult social care, but I just think the costs are so extraordinary. I suspect what we see next week is a slightly different model, but they're working on it as we speak. So
yeah, and there's obviously a big question as to whether or not they try very hard to get other parties on board with it, which I think we're suspecting they will.
Yeah.
When I spoke to Kemi Badenoch last week about this question of whether or not, on social care, for example, she might be willing to work with Andy Burnham. Obviously, you've mentioned that he feels very bruised about the way in which other parties turned on him the last time these reforms were attempted. She essentially said she was open-minded to it, but she wasn't going to write him a blank check. And I think in the early days we've seen maybe a slightly more combative Kemi Badenoch than perhaps you might have expected her to be in the early days of Burnham. So I think it's quite difficult at the moment to see her embracing that with open arms and without being quite sceptical. But I think clearly there is a wider recognition in the public, or this is what those around Burnham will say, that this does need major reform. And if he pitches it in the right way, it might well put the other parties in a slightly difficult position. We know that Ed Davey, for example, is very keen on social care reform, so perhaps he could come around on the proposal as well. But I think there's an outstanding and important question about whether or not they're able to get some kind of cross-party consensus on something like this, which is so difficult.
And it's not just social care that is this thorny issue. We mentioned defence funding briefly, but Andy Burnham has signed up to 3.5% of spending on defence by 2035. What he hasn't signed up to is what John Healey wanted before he entered number 11, which was 3% by 2030. Now, currently, we're going to hit 2.7% of GDP. So that is a big whack of money. And that's on top of, they've got this 15 billion commitment, which is mostly unfunded. They've got to find 5 billion of that at least at the budget. So they need tons more money for defence. And what was conspicuous this week is at both lobby and during one of Wes Streeting, the new Defence Secretary's press conferences, is he wasn't willing, they aren't willing to go there on 3% by 2030 yet. They are saying that having John Healey as the Chancellor, the Defence Secretary, former Defence Secretary, who resigned over this issue because he felt that is a signal of intent. But I think the question is, what is the intent and how much is the intent? And can they find the money? Because don't forget, this issue effectively ripped up Keir Starmer's premiership. It was one of the there were many things when the books are written, probably by Patrick, but when the books are written, there were many things that obviously destroyed his premiership. But defence spending, we talked about it earlier this week, it is this fiscal bomb underneath this government, and we don't really know what they want to do on it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. One is that one of the reasons why it was so damaging to Keir Starmer isn't just because people thought we needed to fund defence. It was because it became a representation of him being terribly and basically catastrophically indecisive at key moments and was not able to rally the top team around a given answer. And that is one of the reasons why it was so important. But I think the 2035 question is quite an important one because it is notable what you're saying, Steve, given that when John Healey was appointed in that surprise appointment earlier this week as Chancellor, everybody just reflexively said this 100% means that we'll do 3% by 2030. That's just now baked in. They're going to have to find all that extra money. Actually, when you speak to people, there's a level of just inserting a question mark over exactly what that might look like.
It's like a penny on income tax, right? It's a lot of money. It's a big unfunded pledge at the moment if you were to go there. And that's one of the issues they face, Patrick.
Yeah, and I wonder whether when we look back on the first couple of weeks of this government, and certainly the John Healey surprise, which everybody in there is really proud of keeping under wraps, as we discussed, that's a significant thing. And we've been talking about calls. I wonder whether one of the most significant conversations that happened this week was the one Andy Burnham had with Mark Carney, because we know, and we discussed this the other day, Rachel Reeves was never willing to join forces with Mark Carney on, the international defence bank he's trying to set up. I wonder, and given we know John Healey at the MOD was interested in creative solutions to defence borrowing, and yes, the markets are sceptical. You need to speak to Paul Johnson later, the IFS, to hear this. We remember the Mark Carney readout at this point from Burnham's call, only for the invitation to roll out the blue carpet and watch their beloved Everton together. But I wonder whether that might turn out to be one of the key relationships in determining the fate fiscally of Andy Burnham's government as much as anything else, because a solution, a robust international solution to defence financing may well give him the space to do everything he wants domestically. But we'll see. As we keep saying, really expensive, really tricky, and given everything that's happening in the Gulf this week, liable to have a massive surcharge added to that bill, to say nothing of the domestic impacts on energy, etc., etc. So a bit like Keir Starmer, so much of the domestic space at home he has for his policies depends on what's going on abroad. But I think there's a degree of self-confidence, creativity, at least at this stage, maybe it'll be ground down by events, to try and think about things differently and more creatively, at least.
I think that is bang on, because one of the things that strikes me about this week is their lovely set piece announcements, right? People like control, and politicians particularly enjoy a set piece announcement. But in the meantime, I was just looking this morning at petrol prices. They are going up again. We are now in the 14th day of US offensive against Iran, and people I'm talking to in government are getting pretty worried again about what is going to happen to energy bills, again, what is going to happen to the price of petrol, people filling up their cars to go away on summer holidays in the UK and elsewhere. And that's the point, I guess, that it is all very well having set piece plans, but when you've got someone like Donald Trump just doing unilateral things on the global stage, they have huge repercussions for the cost of living and the very issues you're trying to address. And that's how he responds to these is going to be critical.
Yeah, and I mean that's just the inherent risk of the cost of living being the key thing that you focus on. It's unavoidably difficult. You can't not focus on it as one of your first priorities, because we know, and there's been polling that UCL and More in Common have done for the Sunday Times on this, that it is the issue that voters expect action on much sooner than any other key issue that they care about. And yet it is also one of those issues that really you have to be quite open about the limited capacity you have for addressing it, really, when it comes down to it. Like, there are so many other things that affect how voters feel and do financially, and the government ultimately cannot control all of that. So it is a massive risk, but it's also basically an unavoidable one. They couldn't really have done this week successfully if they hadn't have done announcements that were aimed to give people, in Andy Burnham's words, breathing space on the cost of living.
So this is at once the cost of living government. It's also the government that's going to address defence spending, and it's also the government that's going to resolve social care. So these are pretty big, chunky things.
And youth worklessness, all of it.
All of it. Sorry, I missed out mass unemployment of NEETs, nearly 1 million plus. Okay, on that note, we are going to call it a day for this podcast. Thank you very, very much for listening, everyone. Who wants to do the red button for the amazing Euan?
I think it's my turn. And Euan has the red button to himself this week, and it is with no small amount of appreciation, gratitude, and humility on my part. I know both of your parts, that I thank Euan Dawtrey for everything he does for us